Thanks very much. Well, I'm going to be a bit gloomy, frankly, because looking at this overall, what's striking is that the first 20 years of the new millennium, which is what we're in, turns out to be a lot more volatile with many more problems than the last 20 years of the old millennium. And in this short thing, I'm just going to raise issues which I see on the horizon, so to speak, making a distinction which is a bit rough between short-term and long-term, but many of these are long-term as well as short-term. And so I want to go through them and see what we're up against, if you like, or what any government is up against. Okay. Starting off, the present political situation is the product of both long-run and short-run forces. As regards the long-run forces, which we're going to look at first, the following are relevant. Growth and inequality, which has already been referred to in yesterday's conference and of course earlier. The country is high in the inequality rankings compared with other OECD countries. I'll be backing these up with some figures in a minute. And that causes all kinds of problems, which we're currently facing. So that's the first one. The economic and political consequences of climate change. That's the biggest problem facing the world today. And we've just heard that it looks like we're not going to be able to reach the target of 1.5 degrees rise in average temperatures above pre-industrial levels. It's going to be more. So that's a real headache. The decline in the effectiveness of UK governments. Now, this is not much noticed, but I'll say something about it in a minute, and it's real. Fragmentation of the party system, which is linked to the effectiveness of governments. The decline of partisan attachments, which no doubt John will be talking about later, means that the political system, which frames decision-making, is becoming fragmented and weakened. And then polarized politics. Now, the form of polarization has changed. Class divisions used to dominate British politics. We all used to use an old quote from the 60s that said, class is the basis of all British politics, electoral politics, nothing else really matters. From Peter Pulitzer, who wrote that in that theme at that time. It's greatly weakened, as I'll show you, and now there's a new big division, polarizing division in our politics, namely age. Okay, here's some data that looks at these different themes. These are OECD countries. Those are the advanced industrial democracies, some semi-democracies across the world. So we're looking at the advanced countries, and the great majority of them are democracies. You can see where Britain is. The one on the right with the most unequal society is Costa Rica. And here we have Chile, Mexico, and so on. And there's Britain, just slightly less unequal than the United States. But all the others, European countries, the Scandinavian countries and so on, they're less unequal than we are. So we have a problem worldwide if you look at the totality of advanced industrial countries in relation to inequality. Global temperatures. I show this to my first years and they're all horrified by it. The zero represents the average over this long period of time from 1880, this goes to 2010, but it's actually continuing. And you can just see how it's climbing. And according to some estimates in recent reports, accelerating. A really big headache with all sorts of implications for the world. This is the effectiveness measure, which I mentioned earlier, that's not much talked about. The World Bank creates a number of indicators of the effectiveness and democratic credentials of governments across the world in relation to allowing participation, allowing voice, regulating properly, and so on. And one of their measures is called government effectiveness. And this is all built on a large amount of opinion data from elites and mass surveys and the like. So it's opinions, and there are other measures, but it's opinions. And the story is, starting in 1996, when the first surveys were done, all the way through, we've gradually gone downhill in terms of the effectiveness, a widespread perception, not just for mass public, but for elites as well, that government has become less and less effective in Britain. And that is linked, I think, to the next thing, which is the fragmentation of the party system. This is looking at all the elections since 1945 up to 2019, and you can see vote shares in post-war elections. And on the left, you see in the 50s and 60s up to the early 70s, we had essentially a two-party system. Liberals got a very small vote, others got an even smaller vote, and it was dominated by the two parties. This is the classic era of two-party politics in Britain. It starts to fragment in the 70s, and if you fast forward up to the 2015, 17, 19, you can see how fragmented it is. And fragmentation is linked to a lack of effectiveness. There are other things that work too, but that's one of our headaches. Now, this is demographic data from a survey we conducted just before and after the 2019 general election. And the idea here is to show you a little bit about what this new polarization actually represents. At the top here, we've got the age groupings, only 4, so it's rather broad brush, but you get the picture. Here's the Conservative vote share among the 18 to 29-year-olds in our survey. It's about 3,000 respondents, 23%. Here's the Labour survey among that group, 55%. In an election where Labour really got a beating, it was its worst performance since 1935. Now go down to the 65 years and over group, and 59% of them were Conservatives, and we see that 13% were Labour. That's age polarization, if you like, on steroids. Go down to social class here, the traditional division in British politics, which I mentioned earlier. Look at the percentage vote for the Conservatives among the ABs, professionals, senior managers, middle class occupations, 47%. Go down to the DEs, that's the skilled and unskilled working class, 46%. Over here, 23% for the ABs for Labour, 31% for the DEs. So Labour did a little bit better amongst the working class than amongst the middle class, but actually the division for the Conservatives didn't exist. So that's gone, and it's been replaced by age. And needless to say, down here, there's the country dimension, big differences between England, Scotland, and Wales, as you're familiar with. And here's just a record of the educational performance. It is striking, isn't it, that the party of the working class, Labour, historically, the biggest group, educational group to support it were graduates. The working class, people uneducated in class terms, I should say, not working class necessarily, people who left school at primary or less, 17% of them were Labour, 34% Conservative. education is another dimension to all this. Short-term context. I put COVID-19 perhaps ambitiously as a short-term problem, and it certainly is for the government at the moment, but I think we can be sure that it's going to be a long-term problem as well. And I particularly, there's a lot to be said about COVID, and I'm sure you'll ask a number of questions about it, but I want to focus on one thing, which is quite topical at the moment. It's about the recovery. To what extent are we going to recover in the short term? Now, the Bank of England published a recent forecast suggesting that the economy will grow by 7.25% by the end of this year, suggesting that the pandemic has produced a V-shaped economic trajectory. In other words, a rapid, severe fall in production and growth, followed by a rapid recovery. And that's the hope. It's going to be V-shaped. But I don't think so. There's some research, and I put a citation in there for a paper from the American Economic Review some years ago by two IMF economists, Serras and Saxena. They've updated it. So you can look this up on the IMF site for more recent data, but it tells the same story. They are much more pessimistic about the effects of a major shock like the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. And what they did in this earlier research was to examine data from 190 countries over a period of 40 years, looking at shocks of all kinds, big economic shocks, recessions, wars, and indeed pandemics. And they concluded from this big exercise that recovery from major shocks is slow, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. And some economies never get back to the full performance. So if you go by that, this is not going to be a V-shaped trajectory. Slow recovery means that the government's levelling up agenda will be difficult to achieve. And that's true for other reasons as well. Once the furlough scheme has ended, unemployment is likely to increase. At the moment, there's this slightly odd shortage of jobs. Shortage of unemployment because the jobs market is very competitive. But I think it's likely that's going to change. There's also concerns in the financial literature about rising inflation. And if this becomes entrenched, the Bank of England faces the big dilemma, along with the Treasury, of tightening monetary policy, which means, of course, raising interest rates. And as we all know, that has significant implications for businesses, employment, mortgages, and indeed, the biggest, in some ways, the biggest victim of this will be government debt. It'll go through the roof as you have to pay greater interest rates on debt. Now, why does this matter politically? Well, look at this. This is more than 800 observations from surveys conducted since 1947 of the relationship between support for the governing party, whether that was the Conservatives or Labour, support for the governing party and unemployment rates. So unemployment rates are along the bottom axis and support for the governing party is along the vertical axis. And there's a correlation in there, which is minus 0.42. A very strong correlation between rising unemployment and a loss of support for governing parties. And indeed, many of these governing parties ended up losing elections as a result. There is a relationship also with inflation, but it's weaker and more volatile. But the unemployment thing is really bad news for incumbents. Doesn't matter whether they're Labour or Conservative, it's bad news for incumbents. And this is true across the world as well. And that shows it over a really long period of time. So you can see the magnitude of the problem. if unemployment starts to rise. It's not rising right now, but it will do if the effects of the pandemic are longer lasting than the government hopes they'll be. Short run of context, again, Brexit's going to have a long run effect, isn't it? But we're already feeling the short run implications. We've felt the effects of Brexit on the labour market in the shops, you know, empty shelves in the supermarket. We're already seeing that. However, the Treasury guidance on this has been very poor in the past. Not really blaming them, because it's so hard to forecast these things. And to illustrate this, in a report published just before the referendum in 2016, and the citation is there, the Treasury was very pessimistic about the consequences of Britain leaving the European Union. And it set out two scenarios: the shock scenario, the severe shock scenario, and the third column is what actually happened after the event. So this is something we can compare what happened with the initial forecast of 2 years ahead. And well, as you can see, it was horribly wrong. Gross domestic product, it was going to fall by 3.6% in the shock scenario. In the worst scenario, it was going to fall by 6%. Actually, it grew over this period by 3.4%. Consumer price inflation was going to be high. Well, it did go up, but only by 2%. Unemployment rate was going to go positive, and actually it fell. So on and so forth. Average real wages were going to fall, but they didn't. Public sector borrowing, the difference between spending and receipts, actually fell, whereas it was supposed to be very, very high. So it's very difficult to forecast these things. So I take positive signals from ONS or the Bank of England, or indeed the other sources, with a pinch of salt. It looks more, to me, likely to be pessimistic rather than optimistic. So up to now, we can conclude that Brexit has not had a major problem for the British economy, but that's because we're only just into it. What will happen in the next few years, and it's also been complicated, as we know, by the fact of the pandemic. These have got mixed up, so it's very hard to extract the true effects. But so far, the effects have not been too bad, but they could get a lot worse, but we don't really know because the forecasting is not very good. Implications for government and politics. Now, I'll wind up there to give you a bit of food for thought, because as I said earlier, I'm throwing out questions here rather than giving you answers. Formidable array of problems, isn't it? Both long-term and short-term. And as I've just said, forecasting is very risky and potentially unreliable. But for discussion purposes, I think the following conclusions about where we are warranted, although certainly not certain. Climate change conference in Glasgow may make progress, but it won't be enough to stop global warming. It's too much of a problem. It's actually, as the game theorists tell us, a large-scale prisoner's dilemma game, and I'll get into that if somebody wants to raise it in questions. We're not going to stop it. That's the problem. The economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit is going to be more serious and longer lasting than the government currently acknowledges. And again, no criticisms of forecasters. They've got a really difficult task in this very volatile and uncertain world we live in. There's unlikely to be an early general election, that is to say next year, or possibly even the year after. John might disagree with this, and I'll be interested to see what he says. And this is partly because the government gets punished by the electorate for launching what they see as an unnecessary opportunistic election. That's exactly what happened to Theresa May in 2017. She kept saying repeatedly after becoming Prime Minister, I'm not going to have an election, we're going to sort this out, Brexit's going to be dealt with, and then did a U-turn because the Conservatives were way ahead of Labour in the polls. And as we know, it all went wrong. And the government then lost its majority, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I don't see an early election, especially with Labour only just behind the Conservatives in polling at the moment, although there are formidable barriers that Labour has to surmount to win a majority. And I'm sure John may say something about that. When the election occurs, coming back to this theme of effectiveness and the problems facing government, we could easily end up with another hung parliament, which means the effectiveness of governments may be further weakened if minority governments emerge that can't decide things. So the ability to tackle these problems is weakening in a big picture sense at a time when we really need that ability. Finally, I don't think we'll need to cancel Christmas, but it's going to be a bleak one for a lot of families, isn't it? As much as he would like to be, Boris Johnson is not Father Christmas. So I end with that.